Hey there, loyal subjects. Tonight we pull back the silk curtains, sweep aside the velvet rugs, and pry open the gold-encrusted chamber pots of history to reveal a truth few dare to face. Royal hygiene wasn't just questionable, it was weaponized. So before you settle in, light a candle, because your ancestors didn't have plumbing, and prepare to explore a world where power was absolute, soap was optional, and perfume was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Chapter 1. The Sun King's Shadow. Let's begin with the radiant center of France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, builder of Versailles, wearer of wigs, absolute monarch of musk, the man whose rule embodied control, spectacle, and scent. Louis XIV bathed twice in his entire life, and to his contemporaries that made him a man of extreme cleanliness. Let that sit for a moment. Twice, in over 70 years. Not a seasonal rinse, not a birthday scrub. Twice. And this was not considered barbaric. It was ahead of the curve. Why? Because in the 17th century, water wasn't refreshing. It was dangerous. Medical theory at the time leaned heavily on the idea of the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Keeping those in balance was considered the key to good health. Baths were believed to open the pores, which, if you believed the physicians, was like opening your body to evil spirits, cold air, and worse, miasma, bad air thought to carry disease. So instead of washing, Louis opted for linen, and lots of it. He changed shirts multiple times a day. His undergarments were scrubbed regularly, not for sanitation, but because the act of changing linen was believed to absorb impurities. Royal valets would rub him down with dry cloths, and sometimes even perfumed wine. The architecture of odor. Versailles, his monumental palace, was not built with hygiene in mind. It was built for optics. A 700-room hallucination in stone, gilded in gold and expectation. It had no running water, no real sewer system. The gardens were manicured with obsessive precision, but the interior corridors were perfumed cover-ups for decades of decay. One visitor in the late 1600s described it as the most beautiful thing I've ever smelled from a distance. The palace had secret latrines, but most people used whatever was nearby: a stairwell, an alcove, a decorative urn. The term chamber pot is generous. Sometimes it was just a corner and a prayer. And with no airflow, the scent of Versailles became a character of its own. Courtiers didn't just tolerate it, they adapted. The courtier's survival kit. In a place where the air was thick with rot and royalty, no one left their chambers without armor, olfactory armor, that is. The Versailles elite developed their own arsenals of smell-based survival gear, each item both fashion and filter. Pomanders were essential. These small perforated metal orbs dangled from belts or necklaces and were filled with clove, nutmeg, cinnamon, or marjoram. Some were simple wooden beads, others were intricate, gem-encrusted baubles that cost more than a servant's yearly wage. One duchess reportedly had a pomander shaped like a swan that opened mechanically to reveal 4 scent compartments, each for a different time of day. Handkerchiefs were rarely just fabric. They were doused in rose water, orange blossom, or vinegar, and carried everywhere. Some were perfumed with eau de toilette and folded into origami-like fans. In times of emergency, say the latrine hallway, courtiers held these to their faces like scented shields. One famous courtier, the Comte de la Rochefoucauld, carried a lemon-stuffed pomander and claimed it warded off both plague and poor conversation. His memoir includes the line, "Better the sting of citrus than the stench of gossip." Another popular tool was the vinaigrette. a tiny container with a vinegar-soaked sponge inside, often tucked into a ring, snuff box, or locket. When offensive smells became overwhelming, you simply opened the vinaigrette and inhaled sharply. Like sniffing salts, but with elegance. Etiquette itself began to evolve around these objects. Different scents signaled different moods. Civet or musk for seduction. Lavender for refinement. Bergamot for business. To smell improperly at a diplomatic dinner could be as damning as using the wrong fork, or voting against the king. A noblewoman's gloves were often scented to match her political leanings. Pro-Spanish, orange blossom. Loyal to the crown, violets. A whiff was a whisper. A handshake was a speech. In many ways, scent became the second language of Versailles. It could flatter, insult, seduce, or declare war, all without saying a word. It was normal to carry a sprig of herbs, a vinegar-soaked sponge, or a glove scented with clove just to survive the Hall of Mirrors without gagging. Public cleanliness, private squalor. Louis XIV dined in public. He dressed in public. He even woke up in public. The lever, or royal rising, was a ceremony in which dozens of nobles would observe the king being dressed. It was a great honor to watch His Majesty put on his socks. What they didn't see? The rotting teeth, the infected skin beneath the layers, the bleeding gums and the lice. That part was private. Louis's public life was so polished that he became an icon of elegance across Europe. But in his private rooms, his valet wrote of changing pillowcases daily due to the night sweats and the damp. In one of the more surreal accounts, Louis reportedly once received a diplomatic letter while seated on his commode. The attending nobleman was honored to hand it to him. Because that's how power works. When you're king, even your bowel movements are policy. The cost of the illusion. It took hundreds of people to keep one man appearing clean. The scent economy of Versailles. The illusion of royal cleanliness didn't just require labor. It shaped entire industries. The Sun King's nose dictated not only his daily schedule but also the economic fate of towns, trades, and regions. Versailles didn't just smell like money. It printed it. At the heart of this economy was Grasse, a sleepy Provençal town that blossomed into the perfume capital of France during Louis XIV's reign. What started as a leather tanning hub became the beating heart of European fragrance. Royal demand for scented gloves, scented letters, scented everything drove innovation. Grasse began growing jasmine, orange blossom, tuberose, and fields upon fields of lavender, not for beauty, but for export. By the early 18th century, Versailles' perfumers weren't just blending oils, they were creating diplomatic currency. A noble couldn't show up to court without a signature scent. To do so would be like arriving at the opera naked. Florists flourished. Apothecaries doubled their rates. Wig merchants offered tiered scenting packages, base notes of civet or myrrh, layered with rosewater, then dusted with violet starch. One pamphlet from the era advertised wigs for war and peace, fragrance adjusted to the occasion. Every season had its smell. Spring was verbena, summer bergamot. Autumn came with cedar and clove. Winter, musk and desperation. And with demand came absurdity. A satirical gazette once reported, "Clove futures rose 20% after a duchess fainted from an unpowdered wig." Fake? Probably. Accurate? Emotionally, yes. The royal laundries used so much soap scented with almond and amber that entire boatloads were commissioned from Marseille. Meanwhile, Spain's bitter orange orchards boomed from their exclusive trade with French perfumers. Perfume recipes became guarded secrets. One perfumer, when asked about his blend, replied, It smells of loyalty and debt. Smelling good wasn't just fashion, it was fealty. If your scent didn't echo Versailles, it echoed rebellion. And if you dared to smell like yourself, well, that just wouldn't do. There were glove makers who scented leather with bergamot oil, perfumers who blended his cologne, then sprayed his wigs and furniture with it, laundresses who hand-scrubbed his sheets with almond soap. Each wig was baked in the sun to kill lice, then dusted with powder made of starch, flour, or crushed petals. One hairdresser noted that a single wig could absorb half a pound of scent and still smell like ambition and rot. Servants prepared Louise's signature cologne, Aqua Mirabilis, daily. It contained citrus peel, rosemary, alcohol, and lavender. It didn't kill germs, but it smelled like divine authority. The mirror of France. Louis XIV was more than a monarch. He was a living mirror, polished daily and held up to reflect an entire nation's idea of elegance. To understand Versailles, one didn't need to know policy or politics. They needed only to study the king's cuffs, his scent, and the sheen on his powdered face. His image shaped etiquette, grooming, and even domestic rituals across France. When Louis introduced a new cologne note, subtly shifting from neroli to bergamot, it didn't just affect his valet. Within a week, courtiers had updated their own blends, perfumers had adjusted their recipes, and the spice trade saw a measurable uptick in bergamot imports. Royal wig makers once noted that when Louis changed the way his curls were powdered, from lilac starch to iris root, dozens of nobles lined up the next day to follow suit. One merchant described the rush as a riot of scent, with men elbowing each other for a sniff of legitimacy. Women's fashion followed suit. If the king favored a lavender sachet beneath his pillow, suddenly Paris milliners were embroidering sprigs of lavender into hatbands. If the royal boots bore a trace of ambergris, entire shoemaking guilds adjusted their leather curing process. In this way, Louis was less a trendsetter and more a gravitational pull. The entire court orbited his preferences. His habits were doctrine. His preferences were law. Even silence held clues. If Louis arrived unscented one morning, perhaps ill, perhaps simply moody, it sent ripples through the palace. Was there scandal? A shift in alliance? Was the musk embargoed? In Versailles, to follow one's nose was to follow power. The ritual of the rot. Versailles had rules for everything, including rot. Underneath the gold brocade, the lace cuffs, and the shimmering wigs was a constant threat that someone, somewhere, might smell the truth. So, courtiers performed rituals not to eliminate decay, but to choreograph it. Wiping was ceremonial. Valets and maids used warmed cloths soaked in rosewater to gently dab beneath the arms and behind the knees. It didn't remove much, but it gave the illusion of effort. Court ladies practiced the petal press, in which they folded dried jasmine or marigold petals in a handkerchief and lightly tapped their décolletage, cheeks and wrists. The goal wasn't hygiene. It was distraction. Scenting wasn't optional. Every layer of clothing had its own fragrance. Undergarments were stored in lavender-lined drawers. Corsets were rubbed with orris root. Stockings were misted with bergamot water, not because anyone expected to smell them, but because someone might. Dressing became sacred theater. One duchess famously insisted her attendants recite psalms while powdering her wig, claiming that spiritual words purified the air more than soap ever could. Another marquis refused to wear anything until each garment had been aired in a different quadrant of his garden to capture the spirit of the breeze. These were not hygienic acts, they were symbolic. Public incense for private putrefaction. Even the act of sitting carried coded gestures. To lean too far to one side risked releasing the aroma of a neglected garment. To cross one's legs incorrectly could wrinkle a scented crease, releasing the musk all at once. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a pressure cooker, a powder keg, a perfumed lie held together by posture and poise. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. The stink was always there. The trick was to convince others you didn't notice. A kingdom built on powder. Every courtier mimicked the king. If Louis refused to bathe, so did they. If he wore ambergris at breakfast, so did everyone else at dinner. To be close to him was to smell like him, and to smell like him was to be royal. In a time before mass printing or television, scent was propaganda. A noble might spend half their income on perfumes and scented gloves, because if they didn't, they'd smell like truth. And truth in Versailles was the one thing no one wanted whiff of. The aftermath. Louis reigned for 72 years. When he died, the embalmers worked overtime. His body, bloated and decaying in the heat, was doused in rosewater and placed in a sealed coffin. But the smell leaked. One courtier recorded, "The king lay still, his perfume struggling in vain." That was the legacy. Not just a monarch, but a myth in musk. And beneath the gold, the lace, and the carefully staged candlelight, there was sweat, sorrow, and a very long line of servants with scented cloths trying to keep up appearances. Chapter 2. The Scented Shield of Versailles. The solution to bad smells. More smells. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was survival gear. By the time you got through a royal hallway, you had encountered about 9 different scents. Lavender sachets in windows, rosemary sprigs tied to tapestries, pomanders swinging from belt loops, and the ever-present musk clinging to wigs. If it had a scent, it was sprayed. If it didn't, it was soaked. Personal hygiene, that was outsourced to chemistry. Pomanders, tiny, ornate orbs filled with fragrant herbs, were carried by nobles in their hands, hung from belts, and dangled from neck chains like fashionable force fields. Some were filled with ambergris, a waxy substance from whale intestines, which was incredibly expensive and smelled like salty decay mixed with leather and citrus. To the 18th century nose, that was delightful. Men perfumed their gloves so heavily that sniffing another man's hand was practically a duel. In France, scented gloves were considered a sign of power. If your handshake left behind the smell of cinnamon and civet, people knew you had influence. Hair? Never washed, not even a little. Instead, powdered. The powder was often made of flour or starch mixed with crushed flowers or herbs. Rose for elegance, violet for youth, orris root for stamina. To apply it, servants used bellows to blow the powder into wigs like a blizzard of fake freshness. The result? An entire court that smelled like a bakery inside a greenhouse, and looked like someone dropped a wedding cake on their heads. The seasons of scent. Perfume at court wasn't chosen. It was curated by season, status, and mood. A scent wasn't just something you wore, it was something you timed. Like fashion, fragrance followed a calendar. Spring was for jasmine and orange blossom. Light, floral, innocent, but not too innocent. Jasmine carried just enough seduction to be interesting if someone leaned close. Summer leaned into citrus, bergamot, lemon verbena, and bitter orange. These were worn by royals and lower nobles alike, giving everyone an illusion of freshness despite the sweltering heat, sweat-stained corsets, and unventilated salons. Autumn meant resin. The court smelled of cedar, clove, myrrh, and spice. Letters reeked of cinnamon. Gloves were lined with crushed nutmeg. Even dogs were dabbed with frankincense before royal hunts. And winter? Winter belonged to musk. Heavy, animalic, intoxicating. It covered decay. It warned visitors that the palace had locked its windows and doubled its fabrics. One winter fragrance blend was reportedly so thick with ambergris and civet that a maid passed out while unpacking it. And then there was morning. Morning had its own scent palette: cypress, burnt rosemary, black pepper, a hint of soot for theatrical gravity. One courtier remarked, "It's not morning if you don't smell like cypress and regret." Even grief at Versailles had to leave a fragrant impression. Let's talk wig culture. Royal wigs weren't just fashion. They were identity, and they were filthy. Lice were a fact of life. Servants regularly combed through wigs to remove fleas, ticks, mites, and eggs. If you were lucky, the lice were only in the wig. If you weren't, they were in your eyebrows. To help with scratching, some nobles commissioned silver lice scratchers shaped like tiny cherubs or angels. These weren't jokes, they were daily necessities. And don't forget the powder itself. It built up over time, becoming cakey, sticky, and prone to attracting insects. Powdered wigs were sometimes hung overnight in smokehouses to fumigate them. Others were left outside in the cold, under linen cloth, to refresh. Royal bedrooms, scentscapes. In Versailles, Louis XV reportedly had an entire chamber dedicated to perfume production. His mistress, Madame de Pompadour, employed her own perfumer, who created personalized scent profiles for every room she entered. In fact, perfume was so central to court life that there was a department of perfumers on palace staff. They created seasonal aromas, citrus blends in spring, cinnamon and myrrh in winter. You didn't just smell like royalty, you smelled on theme. Royal children were taught to apply perfume before they were taught to write. A clean child was a scented child. But behind the perfume, the powder, and the pomp, there was decay. The powdered wigs masked dirty scalps. The scents disguised body odor. The layers of makeup concealed sores, boils, and the lingering blush of untreated illness. Remember, this was the age of smallpox, syphilis, and tuberculosis, all invisible under rosewater and rouge. One court physician wrote, "The palace smells of frankincense, rot, and royalty." Another described a duchess's chamber as a shrine to violet and infection. But none of that mattered, because to the court, cleanliness was about appearance, not essence. And it was contagious, in the fashion sense. If the king switched to orange blossom water, the nobility followed. If the queen's chambers were freshly perfumed with verbena, merchants across Paris scrambled to bottle it. Perfume trends dictated trade. Entire ships were loaded with crates of rose petals, orris root, bergamot oil, and sandalwood to meet the royal demand. These weren't just smells. They were statements of power. When Marie Antoinette wore a new scent, it was said Paris smelled of it for weeks. And when a courtier failed to mask their own smell, it wasn't just an olfactory offense, it was political suicide. One anonymous pamphlet in the 18th century read, "The noble who reeks must be a fraud, for royalty should never stink." Perfume wasn't just a cover, it was armor. It kept you socially safe, medically safe, at least in theory. And above all, it made you desirable. A prince might court a noblewoman not with poetry, but by gifting her a perfume blend tailored to her birth month and family motto. Some courts even had perfumed ink for letters, because if a love note didn't smell like lemon blossom and lust, was it even worth reading? So, next time you sniff a bottle of perfume, remember, you're not just inhaling scent, you're breathing history. And once upon a time, it was the only thing standing between a king and the stench of his own court. The solution to bad smells? More smells. Perfume was not a luxury, it was a survival tool. Royals bathed in rose water, metaphorically, carried scented gloves, and stuffed their sleeves with pomanders. Tiny orbs, filled with spices and herbs, meant to ward off both odor and illness. In Louis XV's court, perfume use became an art form. Whole rooms were scented for effect. A guest might walk from lavender in the morning salon to jasmine in the evening chamber. It was olfactory theater. And it had to be, because under the powder and pomade, things got ripe. Hair was rarely washed. Wigs were powdered, perfumed, and infested with lice. Some nobles had silver lice scratchers shaped like cherubs. Elegant, yes, but also itchy. And don't think this was a French problem. Queen Elizabeth I of England brushed her teeth with honey and soot. She had blackened gums and a breath like fermented sugar and flame. Royal dental care? Let's talk about that. Chapter 3. Smiles for the Crown. Dental hygiene was a royal disaster. Sugar was a symbol of wealth. Royals ate it by the pound, in jams, in pies, in medicines. It wasn't just food, it was fashion, luxury, and status served 3 times a day, and the results, catastrophic. Louis XIV suffered from chronic abscesses. His gums bled. His breath could reportedly clear a ballroom. One account claimed that courtiers subtly held handkerchiefs to their noses whenever the king spoke. Nobody dared mention it. Nobody had to. Eventually, Louis lost most of his teeth. He could barely chew and had to subsist on soft foods, purees, soaked bread, heavily sauced meats. He was the most powerful man in Europe and couldn't bite into an apple. And he wasn't alone. Toothbrushes existed, sort of. If you were lucky, you had one made of horsehair or boar bristles tied to a bone handle. But most nobles used rags, twigs, or chewed fragrant wood like licorice root. Others dipped cloth into wine or vinegar to swab the mouth. In England, Queen Elizabeth I reportedly used honey mixed with soot. The result, blackened teeth, inflamed gums, and breath like burnt syrup. Some recipes for tooth powder called for crushed eggshells, burnt bread, charcoal, or even ground-up bones. In Russia, one blend included powdered brick. Royal mouths were a battlefield, and none of them were winning. One physician advised, "After every meal, it is wise to rinse with rosemary water and chew cloves, lest the tongue rot." Helpful. When it came time to pull a tooth, things got worse. There were no dentists. You went to the barber, the surgeon, or whoever had the strongest grip and the fewest questions. Tools were simple: metal tongs, a small knife, maybe a wooden mallet. Pain relief? Alcohol, if you were lucky. Most times the extraction was done quickly, if not well. Blood was mopped with a cloth, and the wound was packed with herbs or wine-soaked linen. Some monarchs screamed, others passed out. All were expected to carry on with grace. Louis XV once had 2 molars pulled before breakfast. He still attended a ball that evening. Bad breath was everywhere. Sovereigns tried to hide it with herbs: parsley, mint, cloves, rosemary. Some chewed on orris root, the dried rhizome of an iris, used like a breath-freshening chewing stick. Others carried silver boxes of lozenges, sugar, musk, and crushed rose petals. In public, no one dared comment, but in private letters and journals, the truth was pungent. A noblewoman at Versailles wrote, "The Dauphin's smile is white, but it arrives with a wind of decay. Teeth were social currency. A full smile meant health, wealth, and youth. Portrait painters often avoided showing teeth, not for artistic reasons, but because they simply weren't there. When teeth did appear in paintings, they were idealized. The sitter's actual smile might have been a rotted mess hidden behind powdered lips. Some nobles had false teeth made from ivory, bone, or even other people's teeth, collected from battlefield corpses or poor citizens paid to part with molars. These were held in place with wires, wax, or gold threads. They worked about as well as you'd expect. One Habsburg archduke lost his bridge mid-banquet. It landed in a tureen of pheasant stew. The dish was not served. Tooth decay wasn't just painful, it was political. Monarchs who lost their teeth faced more than discomfort. They faced rumors. A ruler's face was currency. A clean, commanding smile was tied to strength, health, and divine favor. A rotten mouth meant weakness, and in some courts whispered treason. That's why false teeth weren't merely cosmetic, they were strategic. George Washington, centuries later, would famously wear dentures made of everything from ivory to human teeth. But long before him, European royals were fashioning elaborate prosthetics to prop up their public image, sometimes literally. One French duke had a set carved from mother of pearl. It was beautiful. It was also sharp. He bled every time he smiled. He smiled anyway. Tooth rot changed diets and etiquette. Royal chefs created entire menus around soft foods, creamed vegetables, custards, stews so tender they collapsed on a spoon, pastries soaked in rosewater until they could be gummed down by a toothless archbishop. Certain meats were minced finely or pre-chewed by servants. That wasn't just a myth. There are records of valets mashing fruit and meat into paste for elderly dukes with no molars. At court banquets, special dishes were prepared for those missing teeth, marked discreetly with ribbons or gold-trimmed lids. It was common for older nobles to carry private spoons with flattened handles or curved bowls, adapted for shaking hands or crooked mouths. Rituals of the rotten tooth. Tooth loss wasn't just a health hazard, it was a cultural event. In Versailles, the removal of a tooth could be theatrical, superstitious, and, if you were important enough, accompanied by a velvet curtain and a captive audience. Rumors tell of a semi-official event called Le Festival du Molar, held once a year for aging nobles and royal retainers too proud to book private extractions. Attendees wore black silk gloves, there was wine, there was applause. One memoir describes a duke who pulled his own molar mid-banquet and handed it to the king's physician wrapped in lace. The band played louder so the ladies wouldn't faint. But the eccentricity didn't stop there. Some nobles believed that burying a rotten tooth beneath a rose bush would restore beauty to the face. Others rubbed their decayed molars with pearls, believing the purity of the gem might cleanse the infection. One baroness had a necklace made from her husband's extracted teeth, which she wore to remind him not to bite with impunity. In Spain, it was whispered that if you burned a tooth on a silver spoon during a full moon, your next child would be born with a perfect smile. Did any of this work? Absolutely not. But in an age without Novocaine, rituals offered something just as precious, a sense of control over the inevitable rot. Tooth loss created fashion workarounds. Fans were popular not only for cooling, but for hiding the mouth. Speaking behind a fan became part of courtly flirtation. It also conveniently masked the results of years of sugar, soot, and terrible advice. Face powder was sometimes dusted over the mouth itself, whitening the lips to match the cheeks, giving the illusion of health even if nothing underneath was intact. Even speech changed. Some nobles adopted a deliberately slow, nasal cadence to disguise whistling teeth or leaking dentures. Royal teeth had their own lore. When Catherine de' Medici's son died in his 20s, some said it was the infection from a tooth pulled in haste. His tooth, according to legend, is still preserved in a velvet box in a Florentine archive. A German queen was buried with her teeth individually wrapped in linen. An inscription reads, "Let them find her whole." At least one Habsburg emperor demanded his teeth be gilded post-mortem, so that if they opened his tomb, his smile would outshine the rot. So yes, royals smiled. But behind those smiles were ruins, sweet-smelling, soot-rubbed, blood-streaked ruins. And when they grinned, it wasn't just ceremony, it was defiance. Because even in the most perfumed court in Europe, nothing reeked louder than reality. Chapter 4. Cleanliness is next to royalty, sort of. Public baths lingered on the edge of acceptability, too steamy for virtue, too risky for royalty. Royals preferred to sweat it out in layers of brocade and hope the perfume held. Yet, cleanliness was still part of royal propaganda. Paintings showed pale, radiant skin. Portraits were carefully posed to hide dental ruins and boil scars. Behind the scenes, royal valets scrubbed backs with linen, wiped behinds with lace, and whispered reassurances as monarchs passed gas like cannons. Marie Antoinette had a perfumer on staff, a toilet chair upholstered in velvet, and a morning toilette routine that took hours. She may not have been clean, but she was styled. Even royal beds were arenas of illusion. Beds were grand not just in size, but in maintenance. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, but they were rarely changed. Instead, they were fluffed, beaten, scented. Servants burned herbs beneath them to fight off lice and foul smells. Royal beds were also symbolic stages. In France, the coucher, the king's ceremonial bedtime, was a public ritual. Nobles would attend, watching the king undress, kneel, and be helped into bed by hand-picked attendants. Cleanliness was theatrical here too. Nightshirts were perfumed. Bed linens were embroidered and sprinkled with dried flowers. The king might not be freshly bathed, but the scene looked pure. The morning routine was just as elaborate. Upon waking, the royal face would be wiped with rose water. Hands were rinsed with orange blossom or milk. Eyelids were dabbed with lavender. Teeth were rubbed with mint-soaked linen. And armpits? Deodorized with pressed lemons or camphor. The toilette was not a place. It was an event. Attended by staff, nobles, and sometimes foreign guests. Wigs were powdered. Fingers were gloved. Lace cuffs were adjusted with tweezers. A good toilette didn't just refresh the monarch. It reminded the kingdom who was in charge, and who didn't smell like the rest of them. Cleanliness had a hierarchy. The more important you were, the more people helped you get clean. Queens had entire chambers for their toilette, with special seats, scented basins, and linen-wrapped mirrors. Lower nobles used shared cloths and less delicate scents. Servants did the hardest work, washing rags in cold basins, scrubbing undergarments, combing lice from seams. Their reward? Exposure to everything, and recognition from no one. One laundress in the court of Louis XVI wrote, "The Queen's gown touches only flowers. My hands touch everything else." Cleanliness was expensive, and therefore powerful. To smell of jasmine in January was to declare your dominance over nature, commerce, and death. A perfumed monarch was a living miracle, not just fragrant but practically holy. To be clean in an unclean world was more than fortunate. It was divine branding. And as long as the branding held, no one needed to check behind the curtains or under the throne. Bathhouses existed, but they were considered dangerous, decadent, and often associated with scandal. Royals preferred to sweat it out in layers of brocade and hope the perfume held. Yet, cleanliness was still part of royal propaganda. Paintings showed pale, radiant skin. Portraits were carefully posed to hide dental ruins and boil scars. Behind the scenes, royal valets scrubbed backs with linen, wiped behinds with lace, and whispered reassurances as monarchs passed gas-like cannons. Marie Antoinette had a perfumer on staff, a toilet chair upholstered in velvet, and a morning toilette routine that took hours. She may not have been clean, but she was styled. Toilet rituals were theater. Royalty did not relieve themselves in private. They had designated furniture for it. The chaise percée, or pierced chair, looked like a throne, but with a hole in it. Cushioned, carved, embroidered, this was not a chamber pot. This was a statement. Courtiers were sometimes present during these moments. Yes, present. In some cases, high-ranking nobles were granted the honor of assisting a king or queen during their intimate occasions. These positions were highly coveted, because in royal courts proximity equaled power, even if it meant holding a perfumed cloth while someone else defecated. One attendant at Versailles noted in his diary, "His Majesty's movements were regular, a comfort to us all." The scented throne. If Versailles had a motto, it might have been, "Even the chamber pot must aspire to elegance." Commodes at court weren't crude or hidden, they were curated. Known as chaise percée or simply throne chairs, these were carved mahogany seats with embroidered cushions, gold leaf detailing, and a discreetly hinged lid that revealed a porcelain basin below. One belonged to Louis XV and was upholstered in red velvet, with fleur-de-lis embroidered across the cushion and a detachable lace privacy screen. It reportedly required 3 servants to transport, and 1 to spritz it with bergamot before each use. The king's personal scent valet, yes, that was a job, was tasked with freshening the throne area between uses. His tools included a sachet of dried lavender, a silver canister of powdered myrrh, and a long-handled fan. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about illusion. Perfume masked more than odor. It masked weakness, transforming discomfort into dominance and rot into ritual. The court didn't need to believe the king didn't defecate. They simply needed to believe he did it with style. A courtier once wrote, "His Majesty does not defecate, he unburdens with dignity." Noblemen had similar contraptions, some with built-in drawers for scented gloves, others with secret compartments for perfume flasks and spare handkerchiefs. One marquis reportedly engraved his commode with the phrase, "May all I leave behind smell of virtue." Perfume didn't mask the waste, it framed it. And in a palace where everything was political, even the smell of royal excretion was curated for the history books. Cleanliness became costume. Royal garments weren't just clothes, they were protective barriers. Bodices lined with lavender. Waistcoats stiff with camphor sachets. Even shoes were stuffed with cloves to mask foot odor. Clothes were rarely washed. Instead, they were aired. A nobleman's coat might be worn dozens of times and never see soap. Instead, it would be brushed, dusted, and scented with oils. Bathing garments existed, linen robes worn during ceremonial scrubbing. But actual soap and water? Rare, and usually reserved for illness or scandal or marriage. Water had moral baggage. In some courts, frequent bathing was linked to promiscuity. clean skin implied idle time, vanity, or worse, pleasure. Which is ironic, considering how many royal mistresses made their fortune in scented baths. Cleopatra's legendary milk baths became fashionable in France for a brief time. Nobles would soak in donkey milk, often sour, believing it smoothed wrinkles. Others bathed in vinegar, beer, or wine. Not to be clean, to be young. Cleanliness was aesthetic, not hygienic. Royal children were trained early. From infancy, they were swaddled in scented cloths. Nurses wiped their faces with rose water. Boys were taught to powder their wigs. Girls were taught to powder their feet. A child smelling of garlic or sweat was seen as a parental failure. One royal governess insisted her charges inhale thyme-infused steam each morning to fortify the breath. Another preferred clove oil drops on the tongue, effective but nauseating. Illness revealed the cracks. When a plague or fever swept the palace, cleanliness rituals often collapsed. Perfume gave way to panic. Rooms once filled with lilies reeked of fear and vinegar. During outbreaks, servants boiled vinegar and waved burning herbs in doorways. Some monarchs fled. Others locked themselves in. But even then, the idea of appearing clean persisted. If a king died of smallpox, his corpse was powdered. If a queen vomited from dysentery, the smell was masked with incense. It didn't matter how she felt. It mattered how she was remembered. Even death had a routine. The dead were washed, scented, posed. Their clothes were steamed. Their bedsheets changed. Visitors came not to mourn, but to admire. Louis XIV lay in state for days. Though his body decayed, his attendants powdered his cheeks and refreshed his perfume hourly. Scent was the crown's last defense, against rot, rumor, and reality, because a royal does not rot. He reclines. So, was cleanliness next to royalty? Only if it was well lit, perfectly powdered, and accompanied by applause. Because in royal courts, hygiene was never about health. It was about illusion, ceremony, power, and nothing shines brighter than a king's reflection, especially when the mirror is spotless and no one dares look too close. Bathhouses existed, but they were considered dangerous, decadent, and often associated with scandal. Royals preferred to sweat it out in layers of brocade and hope the perfume held. Yet, cleanliness was still part of royal propaganda. Paintings showed pale, radiant skin. Portraits were carefully posed to hide dental ruins and boil scars. Behind the scenes, royal valets scrubbed backs with linen, wiped behinds with lace, and whispered reassurances as monarchs passed gas like cannons. Marie Antoinette had a perfumer on staff, a toilet chair upholstered in velvet, and a morning toilette routine that took hours. She may not have been clean, but she was styled. Chapter 5. The Twist, Masking Power with Musk. So here's the twist. Hygiene wasn't just about health, it was about image. The smell of a king was curated. His breath, his hair, his robes, every layer was political theater. Because to rule, you had to seem divine, untouchable, eternal. If a king stank, it didn't matter, as long as he looked powerful doing it. And that's the dirty secret. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was camouflage. Royal scent didn't just sweeten the air, it disguised decay, masked anxiety, and covered every bodily betrayal with a whisper of neroli and nerve. They were about appearing clean, smelling rich enough that no one asked where the smell came from. Because in a world without sewers, hot water, or dentists, the only thing that separated a king from a peasant was how much he could pay someone else to hold their nose. perfume became law, not by decree, but by necessity. Nobility reeked of influence, jasmine on the skin, neroli on the collar, ambergris trailing like a signature. A royal didn't just walk into a room. They announced themselves in scent. The Queen of Naples once declared she would rather die than be seen without her signature gardenia oil. She nearly proved it during a sea voyage, when her perfume trunk was lost overboard. She refused to appear on deck until the ship captain surrendered his citrus cologne as a substitute. And still, she was praised. Because the appearance of cleanliness was more than etiquette. It was royal branding. This branding even reached diplomatic protocol. Ambassadors brought perfumes as gifts. Treaties were signed with perfumed ink. Scented gloves were exchanged like sacred relics. One duke was so enamored with a foreign noblewoman's perfume that he proposed marriage before learning her name. She declined. It wasn't about the man, it was about the musk. Behind the fragrance, boils, fleas, foul breath. But under the court's rules, if you masked it well enough, it simply didn't count. A perfumer in Louis XVI's court once said, "Our job is to hide mortality." And that's what it was all about. To rule was to be seen. To be seen was to be admired. To be admired was to be mythologized. And myths don't smell like rot. The economics of musk. Perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was an industry. A kingdom's signature scent might be harvested in Morocco, refined in Grasse, bottled in Paris, and worn in Vienna. The perfumers who crafted these blends were chemists, artists, and sometimes spies. Yes, spies. There are records of perfumed handkerchiefs being laced with sedatives or poisons. Scents were used to signal political leanings. Secret messages were hidden in scent layers. A whiff of neroli meant loyalty. Vetiver, treason. In the Spanish court, one perfumer was interrogated for 3 days because the queen's scarf had smelled of Turkish rose, a flower not approved for Christian royalty. He was later exiled, not for sedition, for scent. The rituals of olfactory power. Scent layering was a royal rite. A queen might begin with a jasmine-infused bath, followed by a rose oil rub-down, finished with powdered violet under the arms and myrrh behind the ears. The sequence mattered. Perfume was status, science, and seduction, all in one. Palace corridors were engineered with airflow patterns to carry scent toward visitors. Guests often described entering court as stepping into a breathing garden, unaware of the architectural manipulation behind the fragrance. A powerful ruler didn't just rule by decree, they ruled by bouquet. Perfume wasn't just indulgence, it was infrastructure. Royal perfumers weren't mere artisans, they were embedded in statecraft. The most influential perfumers in Europe often knew more court secrets than the diplomats. They composed not just scent but identity. A king might be known not by his politics, but by the lingering notes of bergamot on his gloves. One famed perfumer, Giovanni Maria Farina, created Eau de Cologne in the early 18th century. It was clean, crisp, and masculine. Everything the sweaty, sickly French court wanted to smell like. Bottles were shipped by the dozen to palaces from Paris to Vienna, each flask carrying not just scent, but status. Farina's customers didn't wear his creations. They armored themselves in them, and the perfumers knew it. Some traded in more than musk. There are whispers, some documented, of perfumes being used to deliver messages, signal loyalties, even poison enemies. A misplaced vial could mean scandal. A misblended note could mean war. The black market of smell. Not everyone could afford the olfactory opulence of Versailles, but where there's demand, there's always a dupe. and by the late 17th century, a thriving black market for scent had sprouted in the shadow of the palace walls. Lesser nobles, desperate to project prestige, snuck out of court in plain cloaks and visited alleyway perfumers known as noses for hire. These renegade blenders worked in smoky backrooms lit by beeswax stubs, surrounded by chipped glass bottles labeled with grand promises: Sun King's Whisper, Pompadour's Desire, Jasmine of the Regent. Were they real? Sometimes. More often, they were diluted copies, padded with animal fat and wishful thinking. One clerk reportedly fainted at a ball when his knockoff sandalwood turned sour in the heat. Still, the illusion was worth the risk. One dupe of Aqua Mirabilis, dubbed Mirabilis Minus, became so popular among junior courtiers that the original's creator had to modify the royal blend just to stay ahead of the fakes. But the market had more than counterfeiters. It had artists, spies, professional scent mimics, known only by reputation and rumors. One was called Le Nez Fantôme, the phantom nose. For a price, they could replicate the scent profile of any courtier. Want to infiltrate the bedchamber of a duchess? Smell like her absent husband? Want to eavesdrop on court business? Arrive smelling like someone higher up the ladder. Scent was camouflage, a coded key, a social passport forged one note at a time. There were even whispered scandals, a perfume trail leading to the wrong chamber, a handshake carrying the musk of an enemy, a dance partner who smelled too much like the king. Nothing confirmed, everything denied. Because in a world where perfume was politics, control over scent meant control over truth. And the nose always knew. The ritual of reapplication. To stay fragrant was to stay relevant. Royal balls weren't just about dancing. They were olfactory marathons. Courtiers vanished between waltzes to repowder wigs, rescent gloves, and dab violet tincture behind the knees. Ladies carried scented fans not just to cool, but to create small clouds of influence with every flick. Some nobles swore by a 4-layer perfume ritual: base oil, floral mist, powdered sachet, and finishing tincture. To mislayer was to risk social death, or worse, olfactory mutiny. One court letter recounted a scandal in which a duchess's scent was too strong. She arrived before her name was called, the letter noted, and lingered in the walls long after her exit. Public fragrance, private rot. What the people smelled wasn't the monarch, it was the myth. Take Louis XV, known as Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved. His signature blend, heavy with orange blossom and amber, became so popular that it was replicated and sold in shops across France. But behind the closed curtains of Versailles, the king suffered from a range of ailments, including skin disorders that made him flake and itch beneath his lace. The scent was legend. The man was a rashy, patchy, perfumed contradiction. Even queens weren't spared. Their scents were scrutinized as political statements. If a royal consort wore a scent associated with a foreign flower, say jasmine from India, she risked accusations of being unpatriotic. So perfumes were curated by region, by season, by alliance. A scent could signal court loyalty or sedition. Global trade, global power. Colonial expansion wasn't just about spices and silk. It was about smell. Royal perfumes drew from every corner of empire. Vetiver from India, sandalwood from Sri Lanka, frankincense from the Arabian Peninsula. These scents weren't just exotic. They were imperial declarations bottled in crystal. To inhale them was to inhale conquest. In effect, a royal perfume was a map, a kingdom distilled. And the more exotic the ingredients, the more powerful the wearer appeared. That the sourcing of these materials was brutal, bloody and colonial, irrelevant to the nose. The court did not smell politics, only prestige. The royal nose. If the king's word was law, his nose was legend. In the perfumed labyrinth of Versailles, scent wasn't just camouflage. It was power. And no one had more olfactory authority than the sovereign. It was said that Louis XIV could detect disloyalty by the whiff of musk clinging to someone's collar. His sense of smell wasn't just refined, it was mythologized. He didn't need spies, he had his nose. Scent as status sensor. The court believed the royal nose was attuned not just to odors, but to omens. A noble's cologne was a report card. If you wore too much, you were insecure. Too little? Arrogant. The wrong note? Seditious. In one recorded anecdote, a courtier appeared at breakfast wearing a hint of sandalwood, a note associated with Spain. Louis said nothing. But by lunch, the man's name had been removed from the hunting list. By dinner, he had requested a leave of absence. No accusations, no confrontation, just exile by bouquet. Even the staff was held to these standards. Kitchen boys wore sachets of lemon balm around their necks. Stable hands were forbidden from approaching the main palace unless doused in vinegar and thyme. If a servant smelled of onions or smoke, it was considered an act of defiance. The nose knows. The king's perfumer, known as le nez du roi, held a position equivalent to a foreign minister. He didn't just make scent, he interpreted it. He might say, "The Duchess is nervous. I smell clove beneath her gloves." Or, "The ambassador is lying. He reapplied bergamot too late in the day." This wasn't superstition. It was Versailles logic. If you couldn't smell intention, you weren't fit to rule. Le Nez traveled with the king, maintained a locked cabinet of rare oils, and was forbidden from drinking wine, lest his tongue dull and take his nose with it. There was even a ritual known as the sixth note ceremony, where perfumers would present an unseen vial to the king each month. He would sniff it, eyes closed, and pronounce judgment. Acceptable. Overdone. Treasonous. If the scent failed to inspire, it was burned before the court. A nose by appointment. Not every nose belonged to the king. Some were rented. A secret caste of courtiers emerged, known unofficially as noses for hire. These men, and occasionally women, had extraordinary scent recall and could identify a person's presence hours after they had left a room. Some were born with the gift. Others were trained, blindfolded in flower fields, dunked in spice vats, or sent to memorize the smell of 1,000 wigs. They served as scent advisors, espionage agents, and matchmakers. One such nose, Alphonse le Silencieux, was paid handsomely to determine if a new mistress smelled like ambition or affection. His answer, amber, with regret. The affair was cancelled. Another, known only as Mademoiselle Hyacinthe, was rumored to wear no scent herself. Her neutrality was sacred. She could enter a room and catalogue the politics with a single inhale. Perfumed espionage. Versailles ran on secrets, and many of them smelled suspiciously like betrayal. There were documented cases of poisons laced into perfume oils. One nobleman died after applying Basilicum Royale, which turned out to contain powdered glass and civet. Another collapsed after sniffing a love letter that had been scented with laudanum and crushed valerian root. Perfumed messages were often encoded by layering specific notes. A letter scented with vetiver, neroli, and sage might mean proceed with caution. Another with rose, musk, and thyme could signal meet at midnight. One infamous scandal involved a forged scent, an exact replica of the king's own perfume, worn by an impostor to infiltrate a diplomatic reception. The impostor was unmasked when he reached too far for the wine. The nose knew. The king's scent. Trials. Each year, the royal perfumers would hold a competition, the grand distillation. The goal was simple: create a scent the king would allow near his person. The competition was brutal. Blends were tested on pigeons first to ensure they didn't induce fainting. Finalists were applied to court monkeys and observed for 2 days. One winner described the process as 2 weeks of boiling orange peel and praying to St. Basil. The prize: a gold coin, a kiss on the hand, and the privilege of surviving another year. The loser? Public ridicule, and sometimes banishment to the royal stables. Scent, signatures, and social sabotage. Every courtier had a scent signature, a combination so unique it was as recognizable as handwriting. Losing your perfumer was social death. Borrowing someone else's, a scandal. But that didn't stop sabotage. Once, a lady's maid replaced her mistress's signature violet sachets with bitter almond oil. The resulting confusion at a masquerade ball led to 2 duels, 1 scandalous engagement, and an emergency scent tribunal. From then on, all personal perfume recipes were stored in sealed scrolls, stamped with wax and blood. The final sniff. When Louis XIV died, his body was swaddled in linen and cedar, but before the coffin was sealed, the royal perfumer leaned close. Witnesses say he sniffed once, stood upright, and declared, "He dies as he ruled, strong and unmistakable." The court wept, not from grief, but because they had to learn how to smell like themselves. Chapter 6. The Scrubbed and the Damned. Royal hygiene was not a private matter. It was a spectacle, a symbol, and sometimes a political threat. Now that we've powdered the wigs, perfumed the letters, and powdered over the pus, it's time to go beyond the mirrors and musk to explore what happened when hygiene really mattered. When cleanliness was no longer a game of appearances, but an issue of life, death, and social survival. Because if a king smelled like God, what happened when he smelled like everyone else? Scandal smelled different. When a monarch's odor couldn't be concealed, it wasn't just a faux pas, it was ammunition. In the court of Louis XVI, rumors of Marie Antoinette's dampness became an undercurrent in the growing critique of royal excess. If she could afford diamonds but not deodorant, what hope was there for the rest of France? Satirists painted her with wilted roses beneath her arms. One pamphlet claimed she wore ambergris, not for elegance but for concealment. The nobles laughed. The people seethed. Scent, once divine, became suspect. When Versailles reeked, it wasn't just an insult, it was an indictment. The perfumed monarchy was collapsing under the weight of its own stench. Clean rebels, dirty courts. During the Enlightenment, thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau began emphasizing nature, health, and rational cleanliness. Bathing, once considered suspicious, became chic among intellectuals. Philosophers soaked. Nobles sweated. The palace preened. But outside the gates a new cleanliness was brewing, one that wasn't about musk, but water. Clean became revolutionary. A Paris salon host once greeted guests with, "I washed today." I read Montesquieu, which was more dangerous. For revolutionaries, washing became a gesture of defiance. To bathe was to reject illusion. To scrub was to strip power of its perfume. They wore simple linens, brushed their hair without powder, and passed around mint leaves instead of pomanders. Some Jacobins even banned scented powders at meetings. If your wig smelled of roses, your politics were suspect. servants, scribes, and the soap makers. Let's not forget who actually made the illusion work. The washerwomen who boiled linen until their hands blistered. The perfumers who risked mercury poisoning to keep court wigs silver. The surgeons who lanced royal boils behind velvet curtains while chamber musicians played louder. In London, entire neighborhoods were dedicated to soap production. In Seville, apothecaries distilled rosewater by the gallon. These weren't just trades, they were foundations of monarchy, and they weren't blind. A soap maker's apprentice once wrote, "I scoured the Duke's lace shirt while he sentenced men to hang. The powder would not lift, neither would the blood." Cleanliness had an underclass, and they remembered. Soap as symbol. As revolutions spread and empires fell, soap emerged as a token of enlightenment. Napoleon promoted public bathing and hygiene as a civic duty. In newly built French barracks, soldiers were issued soap alongside weapons. In England, Queen Victoria's reign saw a surge in soap advertisements, tying cleanliness to morality, whiteness, and empire. Civilized became synonymous with washed. Royalty still perfumed, but now they also lathered. Because the people were watching. Modern echoes, we think we've come a long way, and we have. We bathe, we floss, we flush. But ask yourself, do we still judge based on scent? Still package power in clean white smiles and lavender branding? Still expect leaders to look healthy, smell good, speak cleanly, even when the truth is rotting beneath the surface? Of course we do. Because cleanliness, then and now, has never really been about hygiene. It's about who can afford to appear pure. Political campaigns still feature dental veneers and white linen. CEOs still wear cologne that costs more than their employees' rent. News anchors are powdered until their pores vanish. Clean still equals trust. Perfume still equals polish. And the dirty work? Still left to someone else. So scrub your face, brush your teeth, mist your pillow. But don't forget who taught you that clean equals good. It wasn't your doctor, it was your king. And he only bathed twice. Royal hygiene was not a private matter. It was a spectacle, a symbol, and sometimes a political threat. Now that we've powdered the wigs, perfumed the letters, and powdered over the pus, it's time to go beyond the mirrors and musk to explore what happened when hygiene really mattered. When cleanliness was no longer a game of appearances, but an issue of life, death, and social survival. Because if a king smelled like God, what happened when he smelled like everyone else? Scandals smelled different. When a monarch's odor couldn't be concealed, it wasn't just a faux pas, it was ammunition. In the court of Louis XVI, rumors of Marie Antoinette's dampness became an undercurrent in the growing critique of royal excess. If she could afford diamonds but not deodorant, what hope was there for the rest of France? Satirists painted her with wilted roses beneath her arms. One pamphlet claimed she wore ambergris not for elegance but for concealment. The nobles laughed, the people seethed. Clean rebels, dirty courts. During the Enlightenment, thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau began emphasizing nature, health, and rational cleanliness. Bathing, once considered suspicious, became chic among intellectuals. Philosophers soaked, nobles sweated, the palace preened. But outside the gates a new cleanliness was brewing, one that wasn't about musk, but water. Clean became revolutionary. A Paris salon host once greeted guests with, "I washed today." I read Montesquieu, which was more dangerous. Servants, scribes, and the soap makers. Let's not forget who actually made the illusion work. the washerwomen who boiled linen until their hands blistered, the perfumers who risked mercury poisoning to keep court wigs silver, the surgeons who lanced royal boils behind velvet curtains while chamber musicians played louder. In London, entire neighborhoods were dedicated to soap production. In Seville, apothecaries distilled rosewater by the gallon. These weren't just trades, they were foundations of monarchy. Cleanliness had an underclass, and they remembered. Modern echoes. We think we've come a long way, and we have. We bathe, we floss, we flush. But ask yourself, do we still judge based on scent? Still package power in clean white smiles and lavender branding? Still expect leaders to look healthy, smell good, speak cleanly, even when the truth is rotting beneath the surface? Of course we do, because cleanliness, then and now, has never really been about hygiene. It's about who can afford to appear pure. So, scrub your face, brush your teeth, mist your pillow. But don't forget who taught you that clean equals good. It wasn't your doctor, it was your king, and he only bathed twice. Final thoughts. Roses, rankness, and rule. So, what did we learn? That beneath every polished court portrait was a mouthful of rot. Beneath every silk waistcoat, a chest damp with sweat. And beneath every cloud of perfume, a reality too pungent to rule without help. Royalty wasn't clean, it was curated. The history of royal hygiene is less a story of soap and more a masterclass in narrative control. These weren't just kings and queens. They were walking illusions, swaddled in scents and stitched into stories that denied decay. And yet, they ruled, because they knew something modern influencers, politicians, and CEOs still know. Looking clean is sometimes more important than being clean. In the end, hygiene wasn't just about keeping up appearances. It was about maintaining a power structure where purity was for the powerful and mess was for the help. A world where the ability to smell nice could mean the difference between being feared, loved, or forgotten. So the next time you catch a whiff of expensive cologne or scroll past a glistening skincare ad, remember, this isn't new. To inhale court perfume was to breathe in power, debt, and denial. Scent became the script, and everyone played their part. This is the latest chapter in a centuries-old story written in musk, powder, and plausible deniability. Your ancestors didn't bathe, but they understood the power of a good impression. And sometimes that's all it takes. Because in royal courts, and perhaps in ours too, the nose knows. And what it doesn't know, someone else is paid to hide. Sleep, sweet, powdered sovereigns. May your legacy be fragrant, and your chamber pots forever off camera.